I still remember the smell of sawdust and polish that filled our workshop every morning. Dad would arrive at 5 a.m., and by the time I joined him at 6, the coffee would be brewing, and the first cuts of the day would already be underway. I was just 14 when I started helping at Carlton Furniture, our family business. Most kids my age spent their summers at the pool or the mall, but I was learning how to sand down rough edges and match wood grains. Where are you watching from today? Comment down below. You have an eye for this, Emma, Dad would say, guiding my hands as I practiced staining techniques. You notice the details others miss. That's what makes great furniture, and that's what makes a great business owner. My father built Carlton Furniture from nothing. He started in our garage with just a saw and a dream, and 30 years later, we had a 15,000 square foot facility, 37 employees, and our pieces in homes across 3 states. The business was his pride, but I was his joy. At least, that's what he always told me. Someday, all this will be yours, Emma, he'd say, gesturing to the workshop floor. It became almost a mantra between us. When I mastered a new technique, someday all this will be yours. When I suggested a new design that sold well, someday all this will be yours. When I graduated high school and decided to study business management instead of going to art school, that's my girl. Someday all this will be yours. My siblings never understood my dedication. Jason, my older brother, went into finance and moved to Chicago. He visited twice a year, Christmas and Dad's birthday, always with expensive gifts and stories about his high-rise apartment. Lisa, my younger sister, was studying psychology and spent most of her time volunteering or traveling. They were both so disconnected from the family business that sometimes customers didn't even know Mr. Carlton had other children. They have their own paths, Dad would say whenever I complained about their absence. Not everyone is meant for this life. You were born for it, Emma. It's in your blood. And I believed him. Every splinter, every late-night inventory check, every customer I helped find the perfect dining table. It was all an investment in my future. In our future. The calluses on my hands were badges of honor, proof that I was earning what would someday be mine. Dad wasn't just my father, he was my mentor, my boss, and my friend. We developed a shorthand that confused everyone else. He could glance at a piece I was working on, raise an eyebrow, and I'd know exactly what adjustment needed to be made. We'd finish each other's sentences during client meetings. After my mother passed when I was 18, that bond only grew stronger. When I was 27, I was practically running daily operations while Dad focused on expanding our custom design services. We were planning to open a second location the following year. Everything was falling into place. Then came the headaches. Dad dismissed them at first. Too much screen time looking at design software, he said. Then the stumbling. Just fatigue from working too hard. But when he couldn't remember the name of a client he'd known for 15 years, even he couldn't deny something was wrong. The diagnosis was like a thunderclap. Glioblastoma. Terminal brain cancer. 6 to 14 months, the doctors said. Dad nodded stoically as they explained treatment options, but I saw the fear in his eyes. The same fear I was fighting to keep off my face. "We'll fight this," I told him in the car afterward, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. "We'll get second opinions, try experimental treatments, whatever it takes." He just patted my hand and said, "Some things even you can't fix, Emma." News of Dad's illness changed the family dynamic overnight. Suddenly, Jason was flying in every other weekend, poring over the company's financials with a concern he'd never shown before. Lisa moved back home, appointing herself Dad's nutritionist and wellness coach. They spoke about the business in hushed tones that quieted when I entered the room. "They're just worried," Dad said when I mentioned their behavior. "Everyone copes differently." But it felt like more than coping. It felt like planning. Still, I focused on what mattered: helping Dad through his treatments and keeping the business running smoothly in his absence. If my siblings wanted to suddenly play concerned children after years of distance, I could tolerate it for Dad's sake. The treatments were brutal. I'd hold his hand through the nausea and pain, then head straight to the workshop to check on production or meet with clients. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. When Dad was having good days, I'd bring design plans and order forms to his bedroom, and we'd work together like we always had, pretending the hospital bed and medication schedule were just minor inconveniences. "You're running yourself into the ground," Lisa said one evening, finding me asleep at Dad's desk, surrounded by invoices. "Jason and I can help more with the business stuff." "No offense, but neither of you knows the first thing about running this company," I replied, rubbing my eyes. "I've been here every day for 13 years. I know what needs to be done." "We're still family," she insisted. "We care about what happens to Dad's legacy." Legacy? As if they had any right to talk about Dad's legacy when they'd barely participated in building it. 4 months after the diagnosis, Dad took a turn for the worse. The doctors said it could be days or weeks. The family moved into a rotation, ensuring someone was always at his bedside. It was during my shift, early on a Tuesday morning, that he had one of his increasingly rare moments of clarity. "Emma," he whispered, his voice thin but urgent. "Come closer." I leaned in, holding his fragile hand between both of mine. "The business. You've been everything to it. Everything to me." "Don't talk like that, Dad. You'll be overseeing production again before you know it." The lie tasted bitter on my tongue. He shook his head slightly. "Listen, I've made arrangements. Everything's taken care of. You won't have to worry." "I know, Dad. I found the estate planning folder in your office. I've reviewed everything." "Good girl." His eyes drifted closed. "Always prepared. Always. My right hand." "Always," I echoed, fighting back tears. "Get some rest now." He squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll keep making beautiful things. Keep the Carlton name synonymous with quality." "I promise, Dad. I'll make you proud." "You already have," he murmured. "Someday, all this will be yours." Those familiar words comforted me as he drifted back to sleep. Whatever tensions had arisen with my siblings, whatever uncertainties the future held, Dad and I understood each other. He knew who had earned the right to carry his legacy forward. The next few days were a blur of hospice nurses, family visits, and phone calls. Dad slipped into a coma on Thursday. By Saturday evening, his breathing had become labored and irregular. The whole family gathered in his room, keeping vigil. Jason stood by the window, stoic as always. Lisa sobbed quietly in the corner chair. I sat beside the bed, still holding Dad's hand as I had for the past 3 days, whispering assurances that it was okay to let go, that I would take care of everything. He passed at 3:17 a.m. on Sunday morning. The house fell eerily silent afterward, as if the very walls were holding their breath in respect. I felt hollow, emptied of everything except a dull, throbbing ache. But beneath that pain was something solid and certain. I had a responsibility now. To Dad, to the business, to the legacy we'd built together. I would honor his final words to me. I would keep the Carlton name alive. What I didn't know then was how cruelly those words would be twisted, or how quickly, someday, all this will be yours, would transform from a promise into the most painful lie I'd ever been told. The funeral was a blur of black suits and sympathetic murmurs. People I barely knew shared stories about my father that I'd heard 100 times before. "Your dad was so proud of you," they'd say, squeezing my hand. always talking about how you were the future of Carlton Furniture. Each well-meaning comment felt like a small confirmation that I was making the right choice by stepping fully into his shoes. 3 days after we laid Dad to rest, we gathered in the office of his attorney, Mr. Winters. He'd been Dad's friend for 30 years and had helped structure the business from its earliest days. The office was all dark wood and leather-bound books, the kind of place that inspired confidence and trust. "Before we begin," Mr. Winters said, adjusting his reading glasses, "I want to express my deepest condolences. Richard was more than a client. He was a dear friend." Jason nodded impatiently. "Thank you, Edward. We all appreciate that. But we have a business to keep running, so perhaps we could proceed?" I shot my brother an irritated glance. Always the businessman, even at a moment like this. Mr. Winters cleared his throat and opened a thick folder. "Of course. Richard's will is straightforward in most respects. The family home goes to all 3 children jointly, with personal possessions divided as specified in the attached inventory." I barely listened to these details. The house meant little to me compared to the business. That was where Dad's heart had truly lived, and where mine did too. "Now, regarding Carlton Furniture," Mr. Winters continued, and I sat up straighter. "Richard has left controlling interest, 60% of the company, to be divided equally between Jason and Lisa Carlton." The words hit me like a physical blow. I must have misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" I interrupted. "That can't be right." Mr. Winters looked at me sympathetically. "The remaining 40% is allocated to Emma Carlton, along with a guaranteed position as head of design with an annual salary of $65,000. The room seemed to tilt around me. Head of design? A salary? I wasn't supposed to be an employee of my own family's business. I was supposed to run it. "There must be some mistake," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "Dad always told me the business would be mine someday. Always." Jason cleared his throat. "Emma, Dad changed his will about 6 months ago. He discussed it with me extensively. He felt that while you have incredible talent with the craftsmanship side, the business aspects would be better handled by Lisa and me." I turned to Lisa, hoping for support, but she was staring at her hands, avoiding my gaze. "This is insane," I said, standing up. "I've been running that business with Dad for years. Neither of you knows the first thing about furniture or our customers or our suppliers. Jason, you haven't even lived in the same state for a decade." "Emma," Lisa finally spoke, her voice gentle as if addressing a child. "Dad was worried about you. The business has grown so much, and the financial complexities, the expansion plans. He didn't think you were equipped to handle that level of responsibility." "Not equipped?" I repeated incredulously. "I've been handling everything while you've been off finding yourself, and Jason's been playing Wall Street. I know every employee by name. I can tell you our margins on every product line. I stayed. I learned. I built that company alongside Dad while you two couldn't be bothered to come home for holidays." Mr. Winters looked uncomfortable. "Perhaps I should give you all a moment." "No," Jason interrupted. "Emma, you need to understand that this isn't personal. It's business. Dad recognized your strengths and your limitations. The position he's created for you plays to your strengths. You get to focus on the creative side without the burden of running the company." "Without the burden?" I echoed hollowly. "You mean without the power?" "Look," Lisa said, leaning forward. "We value your contributions. That's why you're getting 40% ownership. That's significant, Emma. And the head of design position. That's honoring your talents." I laughed bitterly. So generous of you both to honor my talents in the company I've already been running for years. Tell me, what exactly do you two plan to contribute now that you suddenly own my life's work? Jason's expression hardened. I'm relocating back here. I've already given notice at my firm. I'll be handling the financial strategy, expansion plans, and major business decisions. Lisa will oversee HR, marketing, and client relations. And what about the actual furniture? I asked. Do either of you know the difference between oak and maple? Can you spot a defect in a finish? Do you understand why our joinery technique is superior to our competitors? That's exactly why we need you in design, Lisa said placatingly. You know all that stuff. We're not trying to push you out, Emma. We're trying to give everyone a role that fits their strengths. I turned to Mr. Winters. Did my father leave any explanation for this arrangement? Any letter or recording? He shook his head. I'm afraid not. Richard was quite clear about his wishes, though. The betrayal cut so deep I could barely breathe. Every "someday all this will be yours" had been a lie. Or worse, a truth that changed when Dad became ill and my siblings suddenly took an interest in what they'd ignored for years. We're having a staff meeting tomorrow morning, Jason said, checking his watch. We'd like you to be there when we announce the new management structure. I stared at him in disbelief. You're already making announcements? Dad's been gone less than a week. The business can't wait, Emma. You know that better than anyone. 3 days later, I stood in the back of our conference room as Jason addressed the assembled staff. People I'd worked alongside for years glanced at me with confusion or pity. Jason spoke about exciting new directions and honoring Dad's vision through necessary changes. Lisa handed out a revised organizational chart showing her and Jason at the top, with my name in a small box labeled Design Department. After the meeting, Marco, our production manager who'd worked with Dad for 20 years, approached me. This doesn't seem right, Emma. Everyone knows how much you've put into this place. I appreciated his support, but what could be done? It's what Dad wanted, apparently, I said, the words tasting like ash. That night, Jason and Lisa called me to what had once been Dad's office, now Jason's, with all of Dad's personal touches already removed. We've been reviewing the books, Jason began without preamble. And we have concerns about some of your decisions over the past year. The custom line you developed is operating at a lower margin than our standard products. Because it's establishing our reputation in the high-end market, I explained, feeling like I was talking to strangers. Those clients refer others, and the prestige elevates our brand's perceived value. Lisa shook her head. That's not a measurable return, Emma. We need to focus on clear metrics. Dad understood the value of building relationships and reputation, I said. Not everything that matters shows up immediately on a balance sheet. Dad also knew when to listen to experts, Jason replied sharply, which is why he left control to us. He knew you would fail if given full control. His words hit like a physical blow. He said that? Jason had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. Not in those exact words, but it was clear from his decisions. He wanted to protect you and the company. I stood up, suddenly certain of what I needed to do. I quit. Lisa looked alarmed. What? You can't quit. What about your 40%? Keep it, I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. Buy me out, whatever the fair market value is. I don't want any part of this farce. Don't be dramatic, Jason sighed. Where will you go? What will you do? Furniture making is all you know. I walked to the door and turned for one last look at what should have been mine. What had been mine in all but name. You're right about one thing, Jason. I do know furniture. Better than either of you ever will. I walked out without another word, leaving behind everything I'd worked for. Everything I'd believed was my destiny. As I drove away from Carlton Furniture for what I thought was the last time, I had no idea what came next. I only knew that I wouldn't spend my life watching my siblings dismantle my father's legacy piece by piece. What I didn't realize then was that this ending was actually the beginning of something much bigger than I could have imagined. When I drove away from Carlton Furniture that day, I had $3,400 in my checking account, a small apartment full of furniture I'd made with my own hands, and absolutely no idea what came next. The betrayal was so fresh that sometimes I'd wake up gasping for air, the weight of it pressing down on my chest like a physical thing. For 2 weeks, I barely left my apartment. I ignored calls from Lisa and blocked Jason's number entirely after his third voicemail about reconsidering my rash decision. I couldn't bear to drive past the workshop knowing others were touching my tools, changing my designs, dismantling everything Dad and I had built. It was Marco who finally pulled me out of my spiral. He showed up at my door with a pizza and a 6-pack of beer one Friday evening. "I figured you weren't answering your phone for a reason," he said when I opened the door, "but I thought you might still answer your door." We sat on my balcony as the sun set, and he told me what was happening at Carlton. Jason had already brought in consultants to streamline operations. 2 of our oldest craftsmen had quit in protest. Customer complaints were piling up because Jason had decided to switch suppliers for our hardware to save costs, not understanding that the cheaper hinges simply wouldn't hold up over time. "The place is a shadow of what it was," Marco said sadly. "Your father would be heartbroken." "I can't fix it," I replied, picking at the label on my beer bottle. "Trust me, I've played out every scenario. They own controlling interest. There's nothing I can do." Marco was quiet for a moment. "Maybe not from the inside," he finally said. "But haven't you wondered why your dad's old friend Walter Jenkins hasn't been by the shop since the funeral?" Walter Jenkins owned Jenkins Fine Furnishings in Asheville, about 3 hours away. He and Dad had been friendly competitors for decades, often referring clients to each other when a project better suited the other's expertise. "I assumed he was just giving the family space to grieve," I said. Marco shook his head. "He's been asking about you. Wanted your contact information. I told Jason, but..." He shrugged. "I don't think Jason passed the message along." The next day, I called Walter. By the end of the week, I was in Asheville, interviewing for a position with his company. It wasn't ownership, it wasn't even management, but it was a fresh start in a place where people understood and valued craftsmanship. "You're overqualified," Walter said bluntly after I showed him my portfolio. "But I'd be a fool not to hire you. Your father taught you well." I started the following Monday as a senior craftsman at Jenkins Fine Furnishings. The workshop was smaller than Carlton's, but impeccably organized and full of skilled artisans who took pride in their work. It felt like coming home in a way I hadn't expected. At night, I'd return to the small, furnished apartment I was renting and open my laptop. I started keeping detailed notes on every inefficiency I observed at Jenkins, every missed opportunity, every process that could be improved. Not because Walter was doing a bad job, quite the opposite. His business was solid, but I could see ways to make it exceptional. I also couldn't stop myself from tracking Carlton Furniture's slow decline. I created a spreadsheet documenting every negative review that appeared online, every complaint posted to industry forums, every rumor of delayed orders or quality issues. It wasn't healthy, perhaps, but it felt necessary, like watching a car crash in slow motion. 6 months into my time at Jenkins, Walter called me into his office on a Friday afternoon. "You've got ideas, Emma," he said without preamble. "I see you watching our operations. I know that look. Your father had it too. So let's hear them." I hesitated, caught off guard by his directness. "I'm not trying to overstep." "Of course you are," he laughed. "And you should be. You were born to run a furniture business, not just work in one. So tell me what you'd change around here." That conversation lasted 4 hours. By the end, Walter had created a new position for me, Director of Operations. My salary doubled, and more importantly, I had the authority to implement the improvements I'd been silently cataloging. Within a year, Jenkins Fine Furnishings had increased productivity by 28% without sacrificing quality. We'd expanded our client base into 2 new states. Profits were up, and Walter was thrilled. "I've never seen anything like it," he told me one day. "You've transformed this place." "I had a good teacher," I replied, thinking of Dad. "2 good teachers," Walter corrected. "Your father and failure. Nothing teaches like watching something you love being destroyed by incompetence." He wasn't wrong. Every decision I made at Jenkins was informed not just by what Dad had taught me, but by watching Jason and Lisa dismantle his legacy through 1,000 small, short-sighted decisions. During my second year at Jenkins, I received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Grayson had been Dad's attorney before Mr. Winters, and had remained a family friend even after his retirement. He requested to meet for coffee on a Saturday morning. "I've been keeping tabs on you," he said after we exchanged pleasantries. "Walter speaks very highly of your work." "I've found a good home there," I replied carefully, unsure of his purpose. "And Carlton Furniture? Do you keep in touch with your siblings?" I stared into my coffee. "We exchange brief texts on birthdays and holidays. That's about it." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "I'm not surprised. They're struggling, you know. The business is down nearly 40% from when your father was alive." "I know," I admitted. I still couldn't help checking their online presence occasionally. "Have you ever heard of Meridian Holdings?" he asked, seemingly changing the subject. I shook my head. "It's a private equity group that specializes in acquiring distressed mid-size manufacturing businesses. They're particularly interested in companies with strong histories and damaged presence." Something clicked in my mind. "Are they looking at Carlton?" Thomas smiled slightly. "They're looking at several businesses in the region, but yes, Carlton is on their radar, and I happen to sit on their advisory board." My heart raced as I considered the implications. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Meridian isn't just interested in acquiring businesses. They're interested in acquiring the right leadership for those businesses." He slid a business card across the table. "Their managing director would very much like to meet you." 2 weeks later, I sat in a sleek conference room in Charlotte, explaining to Meridian's leadership team exactly what had gone wrong at Carlton Furniture and what it would take to fix it. "Your analysis is impressive," said Diane Forrester, Meridian's managing director. "But what makes you think your siblings would sell?" "They're business people first," I replied. "Jason especially. The company's value drops every quarter. He'll cut his losses before he lets it fail completely, especially if the offer is strong enough to save face." "And you're comfortable with this?" she asked. "Potentially taking over the company your father left to them?" I met her gaze steadily. My father built that company to create beautiful furniture that would become family heirlooms. Every piece that leaves that workshop carries his name. My name. I'm not comfortable watching that legacy turn to dust because of pride or sentimentality. What followed was 6 months of the most intense work of my life. By day, I continued my role at Jenkins, implementing improvements and building the company's reputation. By night, I worked with Meridian's team, developing a detailed assessment of Carlton Furniture's weaknesses and a comprehensive turnaround plan. Walter figured out what was happening, of course. He was too smart not to notice my late nights and distracted moments. "When you take back your family's company," he said one evening as we locked up the workshop, "I expect you to remember who gave you shelter during the storm." I looked at him in surprise. "You knew?" He laughed. "Emma, I've known since the day Thomas Grayson came to town. This business is too small for secrets that big." His expression softened. "Your father would be proud of how you've handled all this, taking the long view, building your skills, waiting for the right moment. They might not sell, I said, voicing my deepest fear. Walter patted my shoulder. They'll sell, and when they do, you'll be ready. I didn't know then how right he was, or how complete my return would be. I couldn't have imagined the look on Jason's face when he realized who was really behind Meridian's offer, or the satisfaction I would feel reclaiming my father's legacy piece by beautiful piece. All I knew was that sometimes the longest way around is the shortest way home, and I was finally on the path back to where I belonged. The call came on a Tuesday morning, just as I was reviewing the quarterly production numbers at Jenkins. Diane Forrester's name flashed on my phone screen. "They've agreed to preliminary discussions," she said without preamble. "Jason reached out yesterday. He's trying to position it as a strategic partnership, but it's clear they're desperate." My heart raced. After 3 years of waiting, planning, and building my skills, the moment was finally approaching. Meridian's analysts had predicted Carlton Furniture would face a critical cash flow crisis by the end of the quarter, but I hadn't dared hope Jason would reach out this soon. "How desperate?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "They've missed payments to 3 major suppliers. Word is they're 2 weeks away from laying off half the production staff." Diane's voice was clinical, but I could hear the note of satisfaction. "The company's valued at less than half what it was when your father was running it." I closed my eyes, picturing the workshop floor, the faces of craftsmen who'd known me since I was a teenager. People with families, mortgages, lives built around the security my father had provided them. "We move quickly then," I said, "before more damage is done." Over the next 2 weeks, Meridian's team conducted their official due diligence while I finalized the turnaround strategy. We agreed that my involvement would remain confidential until after the deal was signed. Diane would lead the negotiations, with me as an unnamed consultant providing industry expertise. The deception wasn't about creating a dramatic reveal, though I admit I did imagine that moment often. It was strategic. Jason and Lisa would never sell to me directly. Their pride wouldn't allow it. They needed to believe they were making a smart business decision, securing a partnership with a respected investment firm that would save them from the consequences of their own mismanagement. The final meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon at Meridian's offices in Charlotte. I arrived early, settling into a small conference room adjacent to the main boardroom where the signing would take place. Through a one-way glass panel, I could observe without being seen. A theatrical touch Diane had arranged, understanding how important this moment was to me. Jason arrived first, looking thinner than I remembered, stress evident in the new lines around his eyes. Lisa came 10 minutes later, her usual confident demeanor muted. They didn't speak to each other while they waited, sitting on opposite sides of the table checking their phones. Whatever united front they'd presented at Dad's funeral had clearly fractured under the pressure of failing together. Diane entered with her team, all polished professionalism as she laid out the final terms of the acquisition. The offer was fair but firm. Meridian would acquire 100% ownership of Carlton Furniture, with payment structured to include an upfront sum and performance-based earnouts over 3 years. Jason and Lisa would transition out of the company within 6 months. "Who will run the company during this transition?" Lisa asked, speaking for the first time since pleasantries had been exchanged. "Meridian has already selected new leadership," Diane replied smoothly. "Someone with extensive experience in custom furniture manufacturing who understands Carlton's heritage and potential." Jason frowned. "We should have approval over that appointment. Carlton is still a family business, regardless of ownership changes." Diane's smile didn't waver. "The leadership appointment is non-negotiable. However, I believe you'll find our selection appropriate." The tension in the room was palpable as my siblings exchanged glances. They were cornered and they knew it. The company would fold without this deal, and their reputations in the business community would never recover. "Fine," Jason finally said. "Where do we sign?" The documents were passed around the table, signatures applied, initials marked on each page. With each stroke of the pen, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. 3 years of waiting, of working, of planning, all leading to this moment. When the last signature was in place, Diane collected the documents and handed them to her legal team for final verification. "Congratulations," she said, standing to shake hands with my siblings. "I believe Carlton Furniture has a bright future ahead. Now, I'd like to introduce you to the person who will be leading that future." That was my cue. I took a deep breath, smoothed down my jacket, and opened the door to the main conference room. The shock on their faces was everything I'd imagined, and more. Jason actually took a step backward, bumping into his chair. Lisa's mouth opened and closed without sound. "Hello, Jason, Lisa." I kept my voice professional, though inside I was trembling with emotion. "It's been a while." "What is this?" Jason finally managed, turning to Diane. "Is this some kind of joke?" "Not at all," Diane replied calmly. "Emma Carlton is Meridian's choice to lead Carlton Furniture back to profitability. Her track record at Jenkins Fine Furnishings speaks for itself. Revenue up 40% in 3 years. Expansion into new markets. Industry awards for design innovation. She's exactly what Carlton needs." "This is a setup," Lisa said, her voice rising. "You've been planning this from the beginning." I met her gaze steadily. "I've been working toward this since the day I walked away. The difference is, I actually know how to save the company you two have nearly destroyed." Jason's face flushed with anger. "We don't have to accept this. The deal isn't final until the papers are filed," Diane interrupted, checking her watch. "Which happened approximately 2 minutes ago via electronic submission. Congratulations, Emma. Carlton Furniture is officially under your leadership." There was a moment of heavy silence before Jason grabbed his briefcase and stormed toward the door. Lisa hesitated, looking between her brother's retreating form and me. "This won't work," she said quietly. "The employees won't accept you after all this time." I smiled slightly. "I think you'll find they remember who actually worked alongside them on the floor, who knew their names, their children's names, who understood what made Carlton Furniture special." After they left, Diane poured 2 glasses of champagne. "Congratulations? How does it feel?" "Incomplete," I admitted, taking the glass. "This was never just about ownership. It's about fulfilling the legacy my father believed in. Quality craftsmanship that lasts generations. That work is just beginning." My first day back at Carlton Furniture was surreal. Walking through those doors as the owner, not just the owner's daughter, sent a shiver of both triumph and responsibility through me. The workshop looked smaller somehow, diminished by years of neglect and bad decisions. Marco was waiting in the office, my office now. He'd been my inside connection all along, quietly feeding information to Thomas, who passed it on to me. His grin when I walked in was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "The prodigal daughter returns," he said, standing to embrace me. "About damn time." The all-staff meeting that afternoon was tense at first. I saw uncertainty on familiar faces, wariness on newer ones. I didn't sugarcoat the situation. "Carlton Furniture is in trouble," I told them bluntly. "We've lost clients, reputation, and direction. But we haven't lost our soul. Every person in this room knows what makes our work special: the attention to detail, the commitment to quality, the understanding that we're not just making furniture, we're creating pieces that become part of families' lives for generations." I laid out my plan for the company's revival. A return to the quality standards my father had established. Investment in new equipment. Fair wages and profit sharing for the craftsmen who were the heart of our operation. "Some of you remember me from before," I concluded. Some of you only know me as the owner's daughter who abandoned ship when things got tough. I'm asking for your trust, not based on my name or my history, but on what we'll build together going forward. The rebuilding wasn't easy. The first year was a constant struggle against debt, damaged relationships with suppliers, and the skepticism of clients who'd been burned by broken promises and inferior products. There were nights I slept on the cot in my office, days when I wondered if I'd taken on an impossible task. But slowly, piece by beautiful piece, we reclaimed what had been lost. The first major client to return was an old friend of my father's who'd sworn never to order from Carlton again after receiving a shoddily constructed dining set during Jason's tenure. When we delivered his new commission, a conference table I'd designed and helped build myself, he ran his hands over the perfect finish and nodded in satisfaction. "Richard would be proud," he said simply. "You've brought the soul back." 5 years after I walked back through those doors, Carlton Furniture was stronger than it had ever been. Our waiting list for custom pieces stretched 6 months. We'd expanded into a second location, then a third. Industry publications featured our designs and wrote about the remarkable turnaround of a company that had nearly folded. Jason and Lisa? They moved on with their lives, their pride too wounded to acknowledge what I'd accomplished. Jason returned to finance in Chicago. Lisa opened a small interior design firm in Asheville, ironically sometimes recommending our furniture to her clients, though never by name. The irony isn't lost on me. They thought I wasn't business-minded enough to run the company, yet I was strategic enough to take it back from them and make it more successful than ever. They believed I would fail if given control, yet they were the ones who nearly drove it into bankruptcy. Sometimes I wonder what Dad would think of how it all played out. Would he be proud of my patience, my planning, my eventual triumph? Or would he be sad that his children couldn't find a way to succeed together? All I know is that every morning when I unlock the workshop doors and smell that familiar scent of sawdust and polish, I feel him with me. And when I run my hands over a perfectly joined corner, or watch a young apprentice master a technique I've taught them, I know I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. They say success is the best revenge, but that's not quite right. Success isn't about getting even. It's about getting it right. And finally, after all these years, Carlton Furniture is exactly how my father dreamed it would be. Someday, all this will be someone else's. And when that day comes, I'll make damn sure they've earned it.